I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land.
What happened in 1994 was one of the most remarkable things in any revolutionary struggle, anywhere in the world, at any time. You know, it's the kind of thing that revolutionary forces dream of as an end to the struggle. Here you had an election, 490 people were elected from all walks of life. And the settlement agreement said that that group of people would have the mandate to draft and adopt the Constitution. That was the settlement agreement. It was a big thing. And when people went to vote, they were told to vote for the people who they want to draft the Constitution in their name, so that when the Constitution is drafted, it can open up with the words, "We the people." The settlement talks had to define the Constitutional Assembly, because somebody had to define the thing. So the manner of its elections, through a proportional party list system, was defined in what was referred to as the interim constitution. What the work of the Constitutional Assembly would be was defined there, how it would take its decisions, and those sorts of things was all written up in there, that the Constitutional Assembly would adopt a new constitution with a 2/3 majority. Because you didn't want a constitution of the country to be supported by 51% of the population of the Constitutional Assembly only. In other words, half the population will be against the Constitution. You didn't want that kind of thing. You wanted the Constitutional Assembly to work and work and work until they come up with a constitution which the overwhelming majority are going to support. So that concept was very important. Of course, the interim constitution also defined that the Constitutional Assembly could not come up with a constitution that provided for a dictatorship. You know, it had to be a democratic constitution. It had to be one which provided for an independent judiciary, for example, and those sorts of things. Those were the things which were referred to as the constitutional principles, but they were broad principles that would define democracy as such.
If I can take you to the adoption of the Constitution, what was that ceremony like? What do you remember the most about it?
What I remember is it was a plenary. I can't remember the date, but it was 1996. Where the two chair and co-chair of the Constitutional Assembly sat where the Speaker usually sits, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa and Mr. Leon Wessels. And then the President of the Republic at that time was Mr. Thabo Mbeki. And it was a joint sitting in the National Assembly with the members of the National Assembly sitting in the benches, and the members of the Senate were squeezed in the middle, in the corridors, with extra benches carried in, and we sat there, and there was a speaker's list.
My mind and my knowledge of myself is formed by the victories that are the jewels in our African crown.
And I remember vividly, there was so much excitement for this moment after not only 2 years, because before that there was an interim constitution negotiated prior to 1994. So you need to add that period plus a two-year period from 1994 to 1996. And there was such a moment of expectation. We worked so hard to establish this. What's going to happen? There's a speakers list, and there was more than just a debate. Normally we say speakers list and people today look at their cell phones. At that time they did something else or so. That was different. Nobody looked down. Everybody was just focused on the chair, and then they called the first speaker. And that was President Thabo Mbeki. And he delivered his address. I'm in Africa.
I am an African.
And you could hear a pin drop on the carpet. Everybody was quiet and focused. And from there, it built up to highlight, up to the last speaker. And President Mbeki forced all the speakers followed him to follow his line, to say, I'm also an African. From the most conservative, right-wing aligned white person to the most extreme PAC member at that time, we all said we are Africans.
South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white.
So for me, that was a delightful moment, highlight, and that put the seal on 2 years of very hard work. And finally, after that, President Mandela signed it into law. And that was just amazing experience and a moment to remember in history, never to be forgotten.
There was times when there was like real magic and there was moments of real history, like when we adopted the Constitution. Was it the 8th of May? We went into Taine's to get Madiba, get FW. I think everybody was there. We were leading them into the chambers. There was going to be the discussion and everything. We hadn't slept. We were tired. And Tasneem Karim was Thabo Mbeki's speechwriter. And she said, that speech that we had given to her, we're not going to use it anymore. Thing was Tangulamani. We said, what do you mean you're not going to use it anymore? We've printed everything. I said, no, there's a new speech. There's a new speech. And Halia, Thabo Mbeki walks onto that platform and he does an I am an African speech. I went around the corner and I cried.
On the 8th of May, the Constitution was adopted by Parliament. And we ask this question all the time. Because to celebrate that moment, President Thabo Mbeki made
that I'm an African speech, beautiful speech. It was a beautiful speech. Some people saw it as him trying to undermine Cyril. Yeah, you know, he made this beautiful, and it was the first time that an ANC president was giving a speech that was quite Africanist in its perspective. But it was also very lyrical. You know, it befitted the occasion in so many ways. And it sort of is a eulogy to being an African.
We refuse to accept that our Africanness shall be defined by our race, our color, our gender, or our historical origins.
And it's only those people who don't see themselves as African who feel offended by it.
I'll ask about emotion. It was happening after 2 long years.
You know, by that time, I think all of us were fairly exhausted. It was just a huge relief that we pulled it together, that we got through it, that we now had a constitution. And as I say, it's only in retrospect that you realize how momentous it was. You know, we were all happy. Oh, everyone's ululated and we got the constitution. But it's only in retrospect that you understand how fundamental constitution is for a democracy. And that, you know, all of us were part of it. So, you know, it wasn't like you were the exception, you know, and then suddenly you realize in that one moment of time you had that opportunity to influence a constitution. and it's passing, and I think for all of us who had had different traumas, different difficulties and whatever, it was a very triumphant moment. Not in triumphalism of lording it over everybody, but it was just my partner, Ahmed Kathrada, when he talked about the Robben Island experience. He talked about it being the triumph of the human spirit over suffering. And I think that's what that moment was. It was a moment of triumph over suffering.
Can we speak about the adoption of the Constitution? The adoption happened in May. You had a ceremony, an event in Parliament where everyone then now was voting to say they were agreeing that this was going to be the final Constitution. What do you remember about that time and how did you vote?
How did I vote? Do you know that the ACDP was the only party that voted against the Constitution? And it was not nice in Parliament that day. When they voted, it was not nice because we had about between 100 and 120 foreign journalists. The gallery was full of journalists with cameras, video cameras. And when the first party, the ANC, would say we support the Constitution,
to our standing compatriots who have presided over the birth of our founding document, as the management and administration of the Constitutional Assembly, to the mass communication media, to our friends across the globe, congratulations and well done.
there would be an applause. Everybody, on the floor, everybody. On the gallery, everybody applauding. ANC, then National Party, we support, it would be that. DP, it was DP that time, DP, IFP, one after the other. We don't like this in the Constitution, we don't agree with the Constitution, but we'll support. So then one after the other, one after the other, one after the other. Until my turn to speak came. Actually, I quoted a verse in the Bible. Psalm 33, verse 4 says, "The word of the Lord is right and true." So, among other things I said, because this word disagrees, this constitution, disagrees and undermines the word of the Lord, it cannot be right and it cannot be true. Because of it, the ACDP will not support. This constitution does not protect the rights of the unborn, so will not support it. It became quiet. It became quiet. If you understand what I'm going to say, that it was like Satan spoke into my ears. I heard the voice, "What a fool you are. What a fool you are. You made yourself a fool before multitudes all over the world." If you talk about wishing that the ground would open and you hide, that's what I felt. And I looked at the cameras. They were turning with me. And I said, so the world is showing a fool in the South African Parliament. Felt small. A few meters to my chair felt like 10 miles. It was difficult to take those few steps to my seat. Felt like 10 miles. So when I came to my seat, I felt like crying. One of the things I remembered, one of the things my father never allowed his boys to do was to cry in front of a woman. never cried in front of a woman. So I saw all the women in parliament. I said, am I going to cry before these women? What is my father going to say? So I held back the tears, went to my seat. When I arrived at my seat, I heard a voice that said, well done, thou good and faithful servant. I put my head on the desk and wept. It was a very emotional time for me. I wept.
The 1993 interim constitution had mandated that the final constitution would need to be passed with a 2/3 majority. On the 8th of May, Thabo Mbeki, who was deputy president at the time, gave a statement on behalf of the ANC. This is what became the famous "I am an African" speech. The constitution was adopted with an 87% majority vote and established a democratic nation. The constitution still needed constitutional court certification before being signed into law.
The main reason the court was set up and why it's called the Constitutional Court was to certify the Constitution of South Africa. So the text accepted in Parliament, wonderful singing, beautiful speech by Thabo Mbeki, I'm an African, memorable. The text is brought up to us and now we have to certify them, and we are very excited. I was actually put in charge of the documentation, and the Constitutional Court then is given the specific task under the Constitution, interim Constitution, to certify that the constitutional text adopted within 2 years by Parliament with the requisite majority, more than 2/3, complied with the constitutional principles agreed to in advance. That's our mandate, that's our duty. And we decide the public must be involved now. This is not just something for lawyers. So the text then is widely publicized, and the public are invited to give their criticism and make their objections if they want to. And we ended up with, I think, something like 70 challenges to the Constitution, to the text. We set aside 10 days for hearing. Some themes were very big. The biggest theme was an issue that arose from the very late involvement of the IFP in the elections. They were boycotting. They were saying the whole constitution-making process is biased against us, we're not getting a proper hearing. But there were other complaints as well. I remember there was somebody who said, I am a religious person, I believe in God, he said, but God shouldn't be in the Constitution, it should be a secular document. So he said the inclusion of Nkosi Sikelel' Africa in the preamble, repeated in all the different languages, was a violation of the need to have a secular state. We rejected that argument, and eventually then, after 10 days of hearing, we made a point as judges, we never discussed the outcome of cases before we went into the court for the hearing. We didn't want to be influenced. We didn't have a round table then, we had a long table, and we'd go around the table and we'd discuss first the general approach. One of the big questions was, if the text used could have a meaning that goes beyond the principles, but could also have a meaning that is within the principles, do we have to choose the latter? So it's a very technical, legal kind of a question. But we said, let's see how it works out in practice. And in the end, it wasn't all that difficult. We found I think in 9 cases, the text as provided by the Constitutional Assembly did not comply with different principles. And in all the other cases, the objections we overruled. So it goes back now to Parliament, sitting as a Constitutional Assembly, and the corrections are made. It comes to us again, we look at the corrections, and we say, in terms of this reduction of provincial powers, there is a reduction, but because of the changes made, it's not a substantial reduction. Therefore, we can certify. On the 6th of December, Parliament, now the Constitutional Assembly, the 10th of December, it's signed into law by President Mandela at Sharpeville, and it's adopted in a space and a place that's associated with terrible oppression, but also brave resistance, rather than in the halls of some office in some building. And I was told afterwards by Mpinyana, who handed the pen to Nelson Mandela, the president, to sign. Mandela, Madiba said, I think it's Mr. President, here's the pen for you to sign. And Mandela said to him, does it provide for majority rule? Yes, Mr. President, then I'll sign, he said.